Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Wednesday. Today is the 24th day of June in the year 2015, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this, our midweek day, the final day of our broadcast week here at the Virtual Center. I know that when we complete our 2 hours together today, it'll be another 5 days before we get back together again, and of course that's assuming that everything goes well and everybody stays well, and of course I think all of us kind of root for that all the time. So, but I want to extend a welcome to those of you who faithfully turn in, and those of you perhaps who are not regular listeners, participants here at the Virtual Center, but are tuning in now. And I just want you to know how grateful I am that you are willing to devote a portion of your day, of your time, which becomes so increasingly valuable as the years go on, to a program like this. And again, I want you to know that I appreciate that, and I try to do everything that I can do to earn your trust and to earn the kind of respect that you show this program by tuning in, whether it's occasionally or whether it's regularly. I want you to know how appreciative I am of that. We have been dealing this week, we began yesterday, looking at the Pope's recent encyclical entitled Laudato Si', which translates into Praise Be to You. We didn't really get into the essence, the substance of the encyclical itself, and I do want to do that. We spent most of our time yesterday talking about the entire encyclical, how it's been received, how it's been looked at by those who disagree with it, how it's been looked at by those who welcome it and do agree with it, and that's what we've been talking about. And I want to pursue just a little bit more at the beginning of today's program, at least, in that direction. But what I would like to do as well is look at the pieces of this encyclical in terms of, in pursuit of appreciation and understanding of exactly what the Pope is saying. It's one thing to deduce what the Pope is saying from what people say about it, whether they agree with it, whether they disagree with it, and why. I think we can deduce a lot of the content from commentary like that. And of course, the more of that commentary you look at, and the more frequently you do it, as you come across the same names on topic after the topics may change. What we're talking about is people that are lifetime ticket holders, or not just season ticket holders, but lifetime ticket holders to contemporary or current affairs. And what that means is they tend to have something to say on many of the most substantive issues of the day. And after you become somewhat familiar with these names, with these people, you can begin to predict pretty accurately what positions they will take on a particular issue, on a particular item or particular matter. And so, as an example, and I'm not going to go into the substance of her piece in today's Washington Post, but there was a piece in today's Washington Post entitled St. Francis, the Pope versus Wall Street. And the author of this piece was Katrina Van Heuvel, who is the editor of The Nation, the long-time, extremely reputable, liberal, progressive journal, weekly journal. And of course, the position of her concern is what the Pope had to say about capitalism, about the exploitative nature, the extent to which capitalism involves exploitation. It involves the pursuit of wealth or the pursuit of success or advantage at the expense of other people. And so consequently, as a very, very knowledgeable citizen who has a long track record of taking positions on this very same issue, it stands to reason that that particular aspect of the Pope's encyclical would be the portion of it that would most appeal to her. Before you read the first word, just by looking at the title and looking at the author, you can pretty well anticipate what the content, the substance of the piece is going to be. And that becomes true not only of the critics, not only the supporters of the Pope's position, but critics as well. If you recall yesterday, I made reference to an article in yesterday's New York Times by David Brooks, who, of course, for years has been a regular columnist in the New York Times. He's often considered to be the token conservative, if you will, on the New York Times' op-ed page. They have added a few others since then, Russ Delfat being one. But we made reference yesterday to the criticism that David Brooks had of the Pope's piece. Many of you will know that conservative though he is, and I acknowledge that, I have found over the years tremendous insight and respect, and there's something to be gained by reading David Brooks on a regular basis. His pieces are substantive. His interpretation or his conclusions don't always agree with mine, but his mind is alive, and I respect that. And I feel like over the years I've learned an awful lot from what David Brooks writes about on a regular basis. Some of it I agree with, much of it I don't, but that's not really the issue. The issue is what I'm learning in the process. I made mention of the fact yesterday that David Brooks, one could suspect, would probably raise serious questions about the Pope's encyclical, because David Brooks tends to be, at bottom, a supporter of the idea of free enterprise, a person who values the concept of individual freedom and opportunity probably more than anybody else. In other words, Brooks's natural inclination is to fall into line as generally as a supporter of free enterprise and competition and entrepreneurship and all the rest of it. So it would stand to reason, knowing what the Pope had to say in the encyclical about those particular issues, it would stand to reason that David Brooks would probably take issue with much of what the Pope wrote about. And indeed, he does. And the particular issue that I focused on yesterday was Brooks's criticism of the Pope's introduction of the moral dimension into the issue of economic development, markets, consumerism, and free enterprise. Brooks' position is that over the years, primarily dating back all the way into the late medieval and early modern period of the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, there has tended to be a separation between religion and science. The world obviously had become much more secular, And of course, we know that religion, Western religion, went through a very, very traumatic period in trying to deal with and adjust to the ingredients, to the elements of the so-called scientific revolution. Consequently, as I mentioned yesterday, early on in his piece, which is entitled Fracking and the Franciscans, so obviously what this suggests is that Brooks is probably going to have something to say, positive to say, about fracking. And given his reference to the Franciscans, of course, he's referring specifically to St. Francis of Assisi, whose name, St. Francis, the Pope, if you recall, adopted when he was called to be Pope, when he was selected to be Pope. And so Brooks, obviously, in his title, is suggesting that the Pope's encyclical pretty much goes in the direction of St. Francis, which would mean that fracking, whether the results be positive, whether they be negative, whether they be both, whether they equally be both, is really an issue that this encyclical would probably be critical of. So consequently, one can predict from the title that David Brooks is probably going to look at the more positive aspects of fracking as a way to disagree or to deny much of what the Pope says about development and about man's contact, if you will, with nature, or man's willingness to exploit the environment, to exploit nature. The Pope, David Brooks makes the comment and says, hardest to accept. And again, what that means is he's obviously taking, focusing on criticism of the Pope. He basically takes issue with what he terms the Pope's 1970s style doom mongering about technological civilization. So right away, out of the chute, so to speak, David Brooks takes a negative position against the Pope, in spite of, he said, legitimate warnings about the perils of global warming. He says these morph into 1970s styles doom mongering about technological civilization. He also says there are too many overdrawn statements, extreme statements, like the following. And of course he picks the one that so many people who are writing and discussing this particular issue focus on, which is the line, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth," unquote. That seems to be the line more than any other that supporters of the Pope point to. David Brooks points to it as an example of an overdrawn statement. In other words, his argument is it's a little bit extreme. It's clearly designed to be an attention getter rather than an accurate statement about the circumstances or the conditions of our environment. But then he said, hardest to accept is the moral premise implied throughout the encyclical that the only legitimate human relationships are based on compassion, harmony, and love, and that arrangements based on self-interest and competition are inherently destructive, unquote. It's clear from that short paragraph, from that fairly lengthy sentence, that David Brooks is going to point out that the Pope is overstating his case when he talks about the fact that the only legitimate human relationships are cooperation, harmony, compassion, love, tolerance, respect, dignity, all of the other things that we talk about and the Pope talked about. And that in the process, it's going to be critical, the David Brooks is going to be critical of the Pope's inherent criticism, persistent criticism of self-interest and competition. David Brooks is suggesting there, obviously, that these two are overdrawn positions that the Pope is taking in order to make his case. But I think the principal issue, and this is the one we focused on, that I focused on yesterday, the principal issue here is the Pope's introduction of the moral dimension into these issues. And basically, what Brooks is supporting is the separation of the hard science, the development side, from the moral side. And the point that I was trying to make yesterday, and I believe that I hopefully stated my position pretty well, but it seems to me, as I read the entire encyclical, that that's probably the most significant aspect of it, is the introduction of the moral question. And we'll get into this in more depth, not only today, but likely into next week as well, because I really believe these issues are extremely important and they need to be fleshed out so that all of us understood exactly what's being said and what's not being said, because I think that's very significant as well. And that, of course, leads to the tendency of those who would criticize to put words in people's mouths that they didn't necessarily say. And of course, in this case, what that would mean is to be trying to imply that the Pope said things or meant things that he didn't say and that he didn't mean. So I think the more precise we can be on exactly what he did say is going to better equip us to deal with those who might criticize what he says in order to try to imply or suggest that he's saying things that he's really not saying. There's absolutely no question then that the moral question changes the whole name of the game. Because if you consider things like markets, competition, globalism, free trade, jobs, corporate expansion, corporate self-interest, work skills, career skills, income, salaries, income and wealth inequality, all these issues that so concern us in today's world, if you consider them only as issues of logic and common sense, only issues to be dealt with cognitively, with the brain rather than the heart, then it is much easier to convince you to take a particular issue or a particular position on some of these issues. But when you introduce the moral dimension into this, when you make the case, as the Pope does, that in order to truly be Christian, in order to be consistent with God's plan and God's creation of this universe, it is necessary to take the moral issues into consideration as well as the economic ones, as well as the political ones. When you do that, it becomes a little bit more difficult to justify some of the outcomes that occur within the system that we call free enterprise capitalism. it becomes a little bit difficult to justify the competition and the inequality that results from that competition when you are required to consider the people involved, the families involved, the neighborhoods involved, the nations involved. When you are in a position where you are being required to consider those human aspects of these particular decisions, then that causes us to be much more careful and much more principled and much more considerate in the decisions that we make, as opposed to looking at them purely as rational or logical choice, merely as products of human reason. Human reason, if you function according to the dictates of human reason, you are basically saying that what we need to know comes through the brain, as it were. And that all these softer emotions, like compassion and love and concern for our fellow man and emphasis on the public good, on the common interest of the common good, and all of those other things, which tend to come from the heart. And of course, I ask you to think back to the debate that Thomas Jefferson engages in between his head and his heart in the very famous letter that he writes to Maria Causeway, which we looked at in some detail some months ago. I felt that I didn't really do justice to David Brooks's piece yesterday. And more importantly, I didn't really do justice to the folks tuned in here at the Virtual Center, because I tended to be rather critical of David Brooks without really giving what he said a chance to be heard and evaluated by you. It's obviously true that there are positives to the issues of economic development. I mean, David Brooks makes the point that if you read the Pope's encyclical, you'd never know that the world is experiencing the most successful war on poverty, the most successful attack on world poverty that it's ever experienced before, as a result of globalism and the idea of the global market, the global marketplace. The rates of poverty in the world are substantially less, at least according to the way we measure those rates, than they ever were before, because of the lifestyle, the way we are living. So obviously, Brooks's point is you can't just out and out condemn everything we've done, everything we are, and everything we believe without at least weighing some of the positives. It's that consideration that prompts me to begin today's program by looking a little bit more substantively at Brooks and some of the positives that he raises. Because I think that much of what he says, he is speaking for a substantial portion of those who would take issue with what the Pope is saying. Basically, the issue that Brooks deals with first is the issue of cap and trade. It's a minor part. There's one paragraph in the Pope's entire 184-page encyclical that deals with the issue of cap and trade. And if you bear with me, I want to find that paragraph. If I can. I thought I had marked it. But let me do the best I can to summarize it. I was going to basically quote you what the Pope said in that particular paragraph. The Pope's position is that what is popularly known as cap and trade, as the way that nations, the developed world, is taking on the issue of fossil fuels, has been generally supported by environmentalists and is indeed underway in many parts of the world, in many nations of the world. I have found it. The Pope's criticism of cap and trade is in chapter 5 of the encyclical, the chapter entitled Dialogue on the Environment in the International Community. Let me read quickly what the Pope says, and then we can basically deal with why Brooks criticizes it. The Pope says, some strategies for lowering pollutant gas emissions call for the internationalization of environmental costs, which would risk imposing on countries with fewer resources burdensome commitments to reducing emissions comparable to those of the more industrialized countries. In other words, what the Pope is criticizing here is the tendency of major nations to basically insist upon the fact that if we're going to solve the problems of gas emissions, of polluting the environment through the burning of fossil fuels, and if we're going to internationalize the costs, spread them around equally, then all nations ought to bear their fair portion of the responsibility of paying for this, not just the wealthiest nations. The Pope is critical of that. And what he's saying is, this isn't fair. He says, imposing such measures penalizes those countries most in need of development. And then he cites what the bishops in Bolivia had to say about this issue. Quote, the countries which have benefited from a high degree of industrialization at the cost of enormous emissions of greenhouse gases have a greater responsibility for providing a solution to the problems they have caused. Unquote. So what we have here, what the Pope is introducing here, is the debate or the controversy between rich nations and poor nations over who ought to pay for the solutions to environmental pollution. Whether it should be the nations that cause them, or whether it should be all the nations that will benefit equally from these solutions. And obviously the spokesmen for the poor nations are arguing, you guys caused it, you should pay for it. The Pope goes on, and this is the portion that David Brooks most focuses on. The strategy of buying and selling carbon credits can lead to a new form of speculation, the Pope says, which would not help reduce the emission of polluting gases worldwide. This system seems to provide a quick and easy solution under the guise of a certain commitment to the environment, but in no way does it allow for the kind of radical change which present circumstances require. It may simply become a ploy which permits maintaining the excessive consumption of some countries and sectors. The Pope's criticism of carbon credits, which is a favorite tool of developed nations. What you do is you make nations who are major polluters pay for the right to pollute. And what you do is reward the nations who have taken serious measures to limit their pollution. Basically, if nations set targets to improve emissions of pollutants, then the carbon credit idea is that as you achieve measures of success, you accumulate credits for what you've done. And the nations that haven't quite reached the ability to limit pollution that you have can purchase some of your credits in order to pay for their continued pollution. In other words, what this idea of carbon credits does is create an incentive to clean up your act on the part of all nations. But obviously, it rewards the nations who have done the most, the fastest, in the direction of environmental renewal. It stands to reason that these are the wealthier, more developed nations, the nations that initially caused the bulk of the problem. The Pope's position is that there's a danger to this because it allows nations to claim that they're doing something about cleaning up the environment, but in essence, what they are doing is shift the burden of responsibility from the people who caused it to the people that are being most hurt by it. And consequently, it becomes somewhat of a ploy to continue doing what we've always been doing at the same time we claim that we're engaged in serious efforts to clean up the environment. Critics in the United States have been particularly vocal in their criticism of this particular paragraph in the Pope's encyclical, because carbon credits has been a favorite tool, a favorite solution tool of the Obama administration. In fact, here in West Virginia, where I live, the threat of carbon credits in this coal state was seen as part of the Obama administration's war on coal. The Obama administration was trying to get state legislatures to buy into the idea of carbon credits and emission limitations and reductions by making carbon credits available so that as nations struggled to clean up their act, they would continue to have the incentive by nations that have already, or states that have already cleaned up their act, to sell credits to those who hadn't. West Virginia, which is a coal state, of course, took issue with the whole thing and said all of this is part of the administration's war to destroy coal. And of course, there's no question that the whole idea of carbon credits is aimed eventually at restricting and limiting the emission of carbon in the burning of fossil fuels. So that's the Pope's criticism. He's basically arguing that it's too easy for nations who have been the most successful in development to adopt this strategy as a way to sell the message that they are doing something serious about pollution. But in effect, what they're doing is making it possible for other nations to go slower in the process. The Pope's position is that the damage we are doing to the environment is so dangerous and so severe that we can't afford this kind of slow, easy-as-you-go approach to cleaning up the environment. We need something a lot more dramatic, a lot faster, a lot more radical. And the Pope's position is, given what we need, carbon credits are not an answer to that or a solution. They are rather a dodge, a ploy, to kind of go halfway, but not all the way, towards what the world needs. David Brooks takes issue with this. And he points out that these things do very enormous good. And he points out that there's no room in the Pope's encyclical for acceptance or realization of the fact that some of the things we are doing are actually doing good. And that the environment overall, worldwide, is cleaner than it was, and it's getting cleaner than it was, and the Pope's encyclical refuses to give anybody credit for this. And that's the Pope's, that's David Brooks' criticism of the Pope. And David Brooks says that these cap and trade programs are up and running in places like California, and they're working. Why would the Pope just out and out condemn even those? I would point out that while there's a difference of opinion here between the Pope and those who support the idea of cap and trade or carbon credits, the fact of the matter is this is one paragraph, a rather short paragraph, in an encyclical of 184 pages. But of course it goes right to the heart and soul of what the major criticism of the Pope's encyclical would be based upon for those who choose and who are inclined to oppose it. Brooks makes the comment and said, moral realists, including Catholic ones, he says, should be able to worship and emulate a God of perfect love and still appreciate systems like democracy and capitalism that harness self-interest. His concern is that the Pope is attacking self-interest. I'm wondering about David Brooks's use of the term harness self-interest. Do you believe that democracy and capitalism have harnessed self-interest? The implication of the word harness is that you have gained control over it. You are managing it. You are directing it. You are accounting for or making impossible excesses from self-interest. I wonder whether harnessing self-interest is real. Because there are those critics of free enterprise, critics of capitalism, who would argue that rather than harnessing self-interest, these systems, like contemporary democracy and capitalism, are conceding self-interest, are giving in to self-interest, are helping to promote self-interest, are encouraging self-interest in order to perpetuate the system which has allowed those to become wealthy to continue to become wealthy. When Brooks says that capitalism has harnessed self-interest, I'm wondering whether in fact it has harnessed self-interest or whether it has been built upon the reality of self-interest and has redefined the concept of democracy in order to allow self-interest to drive the entire system. Depending on how you feel about those two perspectives, it seems to me, is going to determine whether you support David Brooks or whether you criticize David Brooks in his allegation that capitalism harnesses self-interest. Brooks goes on and says, but Francis doesn't seem to have practical strategies for a fallen world. He neglects the obvious truth that the qualities that do harm can often, when carefully directed, do enormous good. He said, just as within marriage, lust can lead to childbearing, within a regulated market, greed can lead to entrepreneurship and economic innovation. Within a constitution, the desire for fame can lead to political greatness. In other words, what Brooks is intending to emphasize here is that even though there are negatives that come out of the existing system, oftentimes those negatives produce positives. It's not just black and white. It's not all good or all bad or all bad or all good. And that's the basis on which he's criticizing the Pope. And then he says, and this I think I just made reference to a minute ago, you would never know from the encyclical that we are living through the greatest reduction in poverty in human history. You would never know that in many parts of the world, like the United States, the rivers and skies are getting cleaner. The nations with higher income per capita had better environmental ratings. All of this suggests that the system is fixing itself internally. And of course, if you believe that, if you accept what Brooks says verbatim, then you are denying what the Pope's encyclical says. You are denying the dangers of climate change. You are denying the realities of pollution. You are buying into and accepting the realities of mountaintop removal and the diseases of the people that live in regions where mountaintop removal and other forms of environmental pollution of air and water and forests and all the rest of it are underway. In other words, if you believe that the system contains within it its own ability to fix the negatives that it causes, then you can go along with David Brooks. But in doing that, you have to reject all the scientific evidence that's out there to prove otherwise. Much of that scientific evidence is addressed in the Pope's encyclical. And remember, the Pope is a scientist. The Pope holds a degree in chemistry. The Pope is not blowing wind when he talks about science. And one of the things I probably should have mentioned yesterday, and I realized at the end of the program that I didn't, so I wanted to make it a point to emphasize it today. If you read the entire encyclical, there's no way that you can come away from that without appreciating the level and the degree of scientific knowledge and understanding that this man has. He is not writing about something that he doesn't understand. He is doing what I think is an extremely creditable job in explaining science to the masses, to me, who understand so little of it. I feel that I learned an awful lot about issues associated with environmental pollution that I didn't know before reading the encyclical. I found it instructive. And I guess what I'm saying is, there's no way you can read this entire encyclical without recognizing that this man knows what he's talking about. And so therefore, the Rick Santorums of the world, who respond to the encyclical by saying the Pope ought to stick to religion and leave science to the scientists. That statement and others like it sound ludicrous once you read the encyclical. And you begin to realize the political nature of those statements. They are political and little else. And I think all of that is important. And then David Brooks goes into the issue of fracking, which is part of his title. And as you read Brooks, you begin to appreciate the degree to which he believes that fracking is free enterprise's compromise with the environment. Fracking is providing access to quantities of natural gas and oil that we were never able to gain access to before. And natural gas, while it pollutes, is so much less of a pollutant than coal that one can conclude that the shift from coal to natural gas and the employment of fracking to get at that gas not only creates jobs and helps to fulfill the need for economic development and work for tens of thousands of people, but it also constitutes environmental cleanup. It's a way to merge or to compromise the negatives with the positives. If you look at the issue of environmental pollution from the perspective of burning coal, fracking becomes a positive. If you look at fracking and natural gas as a pollutant as well, you begin to recognize that it's the same kind of halfway measure that cap and trade is. And therefore, it falls victim, potentially, to the idea of what the Pope calls a sop, a ploy, a situation which enables the people to claim that they're being environmentally friendly while they continue to profit and they continue to exploit and they continue to destroy God's environment, God's world, God's creation. And of course, one other thing, and of course the Pope doesn't specifically mention fracking, as I recall, in the encyclical, although he talks about a process that seems to come awfully close to it. But the scientific realities are that the burning of natural gas seems to release levels of carbon monoxide, which scientists are telling us long term is potentially more destructive of the environment than is the carbon dioxide that is being burned in fossil fuels like coal. But again, this is a scientific issue, and I can't really go into that. But he points out that even the Environmental Protection Agency found that there's no evidence that fracking is causing widespread harm to the nation's water supply. There's no question that water is becoming a major issue in this whole issue of climate change. The drought in California, the extreme rains and the strong storms that are coming from the Gulf and coming up mid-America, with the severity of thunderstorms and lightning and hail and all the rest of it that we are experiencing. I think everybody tends to agree that the storms seem to be more extreme than they ever were in years past.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
You referenced that EPA report, and I just had to get something in real quick. I won't take very long at all. But that EPA report is more than a little bit deceptive, because it did not test, the EPA did not have access to places where we already know the water's ruined.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, in other words, it's kind of cherry-picked. And because people need to understand that the EPA, while the industry, and especially here in Central Appalachia, people act like the EPA is some sort of dictatorial tyrant, quite honestly, the EPA is far more friendly to industry than anybody who's paying attention would really like to have.
Right.
As for instance, you mentioned mountaintop removal. Well, we now know through peer-reviewed science that it is that many people are getting sick as a result of the dust from the blasting that rolls and boils and roils down off of these sites onto innocent people who live below.
Mm-hmm.
Well, would you be surprised to find out that there is not one EPA air monitor in the entire southern West Virginia area where mountaintop removal is practiced?
Mm-hmm. No, I wouldn't.
And
I wouldn't, Bob.
And so it's sort of the same thing with the fracking.
Mm-hmm.
If you test only wells where the water is good, you're going to come out with a report that says, well, there's no evidence that that fracking harms water.
Right.
On the other hand, as everyone has seen, for instance, that water being lit coming out of the tap in the brilliant documentary Gasland, well, that water didn't get tested.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't part of the study.
Mm-hmm.
And so consequently, while this was bruited about, especially by the industry, it's simply not an accurate statement of the situation as it presently exists.
Right. So it becomes an example of cherry-picking the evidence, which we've talked about quite a bit already.
Exactly.
Okay. And I appreciate that, because, Bob, what you said raises, I think, a point that needs to be emphasized, and I'm sure you've emphasized it on your own program as well. And I don't even pretend to be able to go into some of this stuff, the depth that you've been into it, because I know you're heavily involved in the whole environmental issue, much more so than I am. But when you mentioned the EPA, and would you be surprised to know that the EPA, is in many ways more supportive of industry in many cases? That perspective, it seems to me, needs to be flagged and looked at very carefully, because what we hear here in Appalachia about the EPA is that the EPA is the devil incarnate. The EPA is responsible for all of this.
You used the very word, the EPA are devils.
Yes, yes. And what you're listening to, if that becomes your source for understanding the nature of the controversy, then you are getting your position only from one participant in the fray, and you can't afford to do that.
And the other side does not have the means or wherewithal to counter the disinformation that's put out there.
No, exactly. And so, the point you make that the EPA is not the enemy to industry, whether it be coal or fracking, that it's being made out to be. Of course, what you do if you seek to build allies is to frame your opposition in the kind of bold italics that make it appear to be exclusively hostile to your particular point of view. And so consequently, the EPA is being portrayed as being at one extreme in this controversy, when, as you point out, the very nature of the role of the EPA as a government agency suggests that it's much more of a centrist organization, which is probably in the business of trying to somewhat balance the two sides in this.
Well, in point of fact, I would go further than centrist, Bill, and say that they are a right-of-center agency.
Okay. Well, in that case, I was just thinking of the labor organ. I can't remember I'm trying to remember the name of the agency that hears labor grievances and labor cases.
Oh, the NLRB.
National Labor Relations Board. I mean, there's no question that board for such a long time has been much more a friend of employers than workers.
Oh, heavens, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, because it's government, that doesn't mean it's neutral. And of course, one of the things we look at when we look at lobbying and all the rest of it is that government is neutral in none of this.
No, it's not. And the EPA the EPA was created under the Nixon administration when this nation had reached a point where the rivers were catching fire.
Mm-hmm.
And Los Angeles had become almost uninhabitable because of the foulness of its air.
Yes.
But at the same time, it was still created under the Nixon administration, and that meant from the moment it began, it was a captive agency.
Mm-hmm.
And it was captive to industry.
Right. I really appreciate that, Bob. I mean, I think that perspective really adds a lot to this whole position, to this whole issue that Brooks is trying to make here.
Well, and it kind of goes to the issue of, for instance, cap and trade. Cap and trade never enjoyed a whole lot of support from the so-called environmental community, and we've had discussions about how I feel about being called an environmentalist. I don't have time in my life for such parlor games as environmentalism. I'm a human rights activist, because esoteric discussions of birds, bugs, beetles, and butterflies, frankly, don't get anywhere with me.
I understand.
But with regard to cap and trade, it was always a problem because it was just another way to set up another electron passing, profit making, bubble generating nightmare.
Right. That's exactly what the Pope implies.
We don't need cap and trade. We need cap and tax.
Right. And that's the issue the Pope raises, is that it's too easy for that to become a ploy.
Well, right. I mean,
and you point out that indeed it has been.
And the reason cap and trade was put forward the way it was because the hope was that at the same time, because this is all part of Waxman Markey. Wait, remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Remember how Joe Manchin took his He-Man hunting rifle out and shot the cap and trade bill when it was nailed up against a tree?
That's right.
Within weeks of the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. What a man!
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was set up like that because the hope was that there'd be tons and tons, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars, for instance, for the coal industry to pursue carbon capture and sequestration research,
mm-hmm.
Which of course was a total Carnival, Midway, Dodge. It was never going to work. But we were going to give them federal money to do that, and that would encourage the vaunted, beloved, worshipped private sector to then invest in the research as well, and they together would then use the cap and trade system to make money for themselves, to offset any losses they might have from not burning as many fossil fuels. And you could invest in them and buy credits and timeshares and condos and frisbees and wheat checks. And I guess, luckily for us, in a way, the coal industry rebelled and said, no, either we get everything or nothing. And and I think the reason the Pope is right on this. Because ultimately this is an existential problem. As in the ability, I for instance, I don't say saving the planet or destroying the planet anymore. This planet is going to keep on zipping around the sun, whether we're on it or not. And that is the question, whether we're on it or not.
Right.
And as a consequence of global climate change, it is an existential question as to whether or not there will be humans on the planet. And the only way to at least try to make sure, because now there's no certainty. We passed the tipping point. Stuff is beginning to happen. Florida will be underwater in another couple of 100 years if it takes that long. The Gulf Coast will be in Arkansas. Okay. The question now, though, is whether or not we can modify our behavior in enough time to make continued human existence even possible. And toward that end, the only way to do that, Dr. Bill, is to stop burning coal, stop burning oil, stop burning gas. Anything that doesn't do that is only ensures the extinction event that will put us in some future museum alongside the dinosaurs that the cockroaches that evolved to be 6 feet tall and sentient will build as a memorial to their own brilliance.
Bob, I think.
Sorry, I hijacked you.
No, that's okay. I understand, and and again, I played right into your wheelhouse here, and I knew I was doing it. But at the same time, I so appreciate what you're saying, because you're making the point so well that I think need to be pointed out. The Pope, in only one paragraph, suggests that cap and trade or carbon credits are too easily become a ploy to be able to suggest that you're doing something positive about the environment, when in effect what you're doing is diverting the real desire to do something meaningful, and short-circuiting those who advocate it.
Why not keep burning coal as long as, hey, I bought offsets?
Right. That's the same thing that Gompers did with the AFL, in the face of groups like the Knights of Labor and other more radical groups. That what he did was essentially suggest that the working people buy into the existing system, and those who really made the decisions in the existing system, if they were bright enough, would realize that by playing ball with Gompers and the AFL, you could essentially kill these more radical groups. And that's exactly what happened when working people began to focus more and more on bread and butter issues, like pay raises and all of that. And the whole issue of whether in fact capitalism was a system that was consistent with human dignity or a system that was alien to human dignity, that whole issue was put off to the side and left for another day. And now we are fighting that battle with the Pope's encyclical, I believe.
Well, precisely. So yeah. I'll leave it at that, and if you want to take a break, I'm ready.
Bob, I think it's a good time to take a break. We're just at 5 minutes after the hour, so this is a good time, and then we can come back and continue. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We've completed hour one, and I want to thank Bob for his contribution to this. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back, and we'll have a little bit better than 45 minutes to pursue this issue in more depth. This is Bill O'Brien, and you are listening to the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour in this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have about 45 minutes left, actually a little bit more than that, closer to 50 minutes left in our program today. And so we've got a significant time to deal with so many of these issues. Again, what I would like to do, and if we don't get to it today, then I'd like to encourage people to take the time between today's program and our next time for live programming here at the Virtual Center, which will be 5 days from now, next Monday, to take a look at the Pope's encyclical and begin to look at the substance, the content of the encyclical, as opposed to the commentary about it. There's nothing wrong with recognizing the commentary so long as you realize that the particular commentary is being written by people who either support or oppose. Consequently, by definition, they face the challenge of a tendency to cherry pick, to see what they want to see, and to downplay what they don't. And again, we can learn an awful lot from the commentary. But it seems to me that there's a lot to be learned by looking at the content itself. I think we've learned that here at the Virtual Center as we've begun to look at the primary sources over the months of many of the founders, of Madison's Federalist 10, of the Constitution itself, of some of the more prominent and poignant letters of Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and President Washington and others. It seems to me that if you constantly rely on secondary sources, on people who have read the primary documents to tell you what they mean, you are opening yourself to the possibility of being persuaded by the particular agenda of the person writing that particular commentary. And so I think all of us need to recognize that, time permitting, it's really best to get back to the sources and to learn from the sources, because then you allow yourself to protect yourself from being swayed in one direction or the other as far as the overall message of the particular document being addressed. In this particular case, this document is extremely lengthy. It's 184 pages. It says a lot about some really important issues. It addresses the issues of government. It addresses the issues of government's ability and responsibility to govern in the public interest. It raises the issue of the inherent conflict between the public interest and self-interest. It basically links the issues associated with environmental damage to the self-interest of those who are most responsible for that damage. It indicates the susceptibility of the general population to the push and pull, if you were, of self-interested people who have an axe to grind one way or the other in this particular controversy. It basically does all of those things. And I think, again, the primary sources give us a way to really understand and get on top of, get our arms around the substance of the argument, and to recognize commentary and agenda, personal agenda, when we see it. We've been looking at David Brooks. David Brooks is a critic of the Pope's encyclical. He's not a critic of the Pope so much as he is of what the Pope is saying. In fact, in one of his final sentences, he makes the point that Pope Francis is a wonderful example of how to be a truly good person. But obviously, he is suggesting that really good people, unfortunately, aren't the people that really cause things to happen in this world. He makes a statement. I bracketed this statement in Brooks's article because I think it's one that we could use in a variety of different settings. He makes the point, quote, "The innocence of the dove has to be accompanied by the wisdom of the serpent." The innocence of the dove has to be accompanied by the wisdom of the serpent. The awareness that programs based on the purity of the heart backfire. The irony that the best social programs harvest the low but steady motivations of people as they actually are. I can't let the opportunity pass without calling attention to that concluding paragraph in David Brooks's article. It says it all, it seems to me. The innocence of the dove has to be accompanied by the wisdom of the serpent. You'll think back, I hope, to the very important letter written by Thomas Jefferson that we looked at some months ago here at the Virtual Center, in which Jefferson speculates on the controversy or the debate between the professor and the plowman. The person with a sophisticated education and the working man who doesn't have it. And Jefferson's position is that more often than not, we're going to get closer to the truth from the innocence of the working man, devoid of the cognitive games that are associated with education, than we are from the professor, whose mind has been sharpened and honed to manipulate information and manipulate circumstances in order to make their particular position look like the right position. In other words, education at the upper levels focuses on rhetoric, focuses on the ability to persuade and argue and win the debate, which will never get you as close to the truth as you want to go. But when you talk to the innocence of the plowman, the innate honesty and goodness within each of us comes forth. And of course that drives Jefferson's famous dialogue between his head and his heart. Obviously, David Brooks is telling us where he would stand in the face of that debate between Jefferson's head and Jefferson's heart. While the heart is wonderful to see, its innocence is dangerous. Its susceptibility to error in the name of good is too prominent. On the other hand, it's the wisdom of the serpent, the wisdom of the educated, that brings real-world experience and understanding to the expression of goodness that comes from the innocent, that comes from the dove. And Brooks ends his article by saying the irony is that the best social programs, the most successful actions that man can take, are those that harvest the low but steady motivations of people as they actually are. The implication being that the innocence of the dove is not man as man really is. Rather, the serpent gets us closer to where man really is. Using another metaphor, another example to drive home this point. Gesellschaft brings us much closer to the real world than does Gemeinschaft. The Gemeinschaft is wonderful, but it's an illusion. It's not real. Good people living together in community is a pipe dream. It can't exist in the real world. The real world is comprised of serpents. Translation, the real world is comprised of individuals whose self-interest always takes precedence over the public interest. What we need Gemeinschaft for is to soften the extremes of Gesellschaft. But we can never risk the danger of diverting our attention from Gesellschaft in order to try to implement the realities of Gemeinschaft. That's naive. That's pure innocence. That's extremely dangerous. And that leaves us vulnerable to the other serpents of the world who remain out there eager to devour us. We need Gemeinschaft in order to make sure that we don't go too far toward the extremes of Gesellschaft. But we always need Gesellschaft. We always need to be headed in the direction of the serpent rather than in the innocent direction of the dove. What makes the Constitution of the United States the ideal document, its defenders argued, was the fact that it defined man, human nature, as man really is. When Madison talks about factions, when Madison talks about ambition, when Madison talks about self-interest, he's talking about the world the way it really is. But at the same time, you can't allow that to take over. You can't allow those who are 100% focused on Gesellschaft and oblivious to the softening contributions of Gemeinschaft to ever get control. You can't even begin to imagine the possibility that Donald Trump's candidacy for President of the United States is real. It's not even possible to conceive of how extremely Gesellschaft that decision would be on the part of the voting population. Consequently, the optimum, the ideal, is somewhere not in the extremes, but toward the center. That's Madison's model. That's the ideal. the need to compromise, to debate, to deliberate, to negotiate, and to compromise, which is inherent in Madison's system. That's the application of Gemeinschaft. The strategy of the Gemeinschaft in order to soften the extremes of self-interest and factionalism, which could bring us down unless controlled by that. We need the innocence of the dove in order to temper the narcissism and the self-interest of the serpent. But we can never afford to be blinded by the advocates of Gemeinschaft into believing that Gemeinschaft is even possible in this world. That seems to be the message of James Madison and the Constitution. That is the message of David Brooks in this criticism of the Pope. We need the Pope. He's a wonderful example of how to be a truly good person. But he's naive in this world. I don't know about you, but somehow that kind of condescending criticism digs deeper and can be more hurtful than outright opposition. Martin Luther King used to say all the time, in our peace marches in the South, when we're dealing with out-and-out segregationists, at least we know where we stand. Our problem comes from those who claim they support us, but advocate and go along with policies designed to undercut us. They're the toughest to deal with. I think there's so much in this document. And finally, there's one point that David Brooks makes about fracking that for him is very telling. For me, and for the Pope's encyclical, it's telling as well. Because it seems to emphasize where Brooks believes the priorities ought to rest, whereas it emphasizes for me the priorities that indicate just how severe the problems are that the Pope is addressing. Brooks makes the point that fracking is responsible for contributing more than $430 billion to annual gross domestic product and has supported more than 2.7 million jobs that pay on average twice the median U.S. salary. Because some people are directly and materially benefiting from fracking, that justifies it, even though there are other people, so many other people, that are losing. I think that says it all. That $430 billion figure obviously is one that not only is impressive, but the mere fact that it is numerical, it is a number, it is quantification, gives it credibility and significance in people's efforts to try to understand the issues involved. The effectiveness of an argument is strengthened to a great degree by the ability to introduce quantification and numbers into your position. The point is that the article, while it is extremely condescending to the Pope and his encyclical, I would suggest is incredibly biting. It is a very good example of the position and the arguments of those who take direct issue with what the Pope's encyclical is about. That's what I think makes it worth looking at. I don't know about you, but I'm going to remember the phrase, the innocence of the dove has to be accompanied by the wisdom of the serpent. I'm going to take that one and run with it for a while. That's a good one. Let me introduce something else about the Pope's encyclical that we have mentioned, we have made reference to. I know that I referenced in the piece that I shared with you yesterday that I wrote on the Pope's encyclical. And it deals with this traditional approach to countering an argument like the encyclical by introducing the issue of doubt in order to raise serious questions about the validity and the credibility of hard science. The way you can get away with calling hard science junk science is to come up with evidence or what seems to be evidence that contradict it or counter it. But all of this assumes or suggests that we, the recipients of these arguments coming at us from various directions, are objective and neutral and are just trying to figure out what's right. The fact of the matter is, there are many of us in today's world who believe that they already know what's right. They don't need any more evidence. They don't need to collect any more data. They don't need to encounter or confront any more information. That suggests to them that what they believe to be right might not be right. These are people who willingly choose not to know, who willingly choose to be ignorant, to remain ignorant. These are people who run from evidence, who run from counter-argument. And I would suggest to you that this particular issue is a major factor in this whole discussion as well. I want to share with you a piece written in the New York Review of Books in the current edition, which I believe is dated June 15th. The New York Review of Books comes out twice a month. I think the current edition is the June 15th edition. The next one will be the July 1st edition, which is just coming out now. In the June 15th edition, there is a lead article in there by an old friend of the Virtual Center, Gary Wills. You'll recall, of course, that we spent weeks looking at Gary Wills's book on the Declaration of Independence called Inventing America. And we spent weeks as well looking at his follow-up book, Explaining America, which is on the Federalist Papers. You'll also recall that we've got a lot more to do with the Federalist Papers and with Gary Wills's approach in Explaining America. We had promised that we will go back to it, and we will. We have to. But Gary Wills, who's an adjunct professor, I believe, at Northwestern University, continues to write and continues to publish good stuff. In the current New York Review of Books, Gary Wills takes on the issue of ignorance, the issue of willful ignorance, the issue of those people who have made it a way of life to not know. In fact, the very last sentence in Gary Wills's article entitled Holy Ignorance reads as follows: they summon a courage not to know, unquote. He's talking about the issue of science. He's talking initially about Pope Francis and the initial release of his encyclical. He's talking about the inclination of conservative, fundamentalist Christians to fall into the category of what he calls holy ignorance. They choose to remain ignorant, and they justify it by claiming religious justification for doing it. The term holy ignorance comes from a book written by a French anthropologist named Olivier Roy. His last name, Roy, is spelled R-O-Y. Olivier Roy. But as we know, it's a French name. And the French would pronounce R-O-Y, Roy. I don't claim any academic or intellectual expertise in knowing that. What I do know, where I get this, is one of the best goaltenders in National Hockey League history played for the Montreal Canadiens, and his name was Patrick Roy. And his last name was spelled R-O-Y, and it was pronounced Roy, Patrick Roy. He is now, as I think about it, the coach of the National Hockey League Colorado Avalanche, based in Denver. But he's a Hall of Fame goalie. I grew up watching him play. Actually, I grew up watching Jacques Plante play, who preceded him with the Montreal Canadiens. But that's how I know that Olivier Roy is not Olivier Roy. But anyway, that's a minor point. Some years ago, and not a whole lot of years ago, I don't have the exact publication date here with me, Olivier Roy wrote a book entitled Holy Ignorance. It's one in a series of books that he has written in order to become known as one of the world's foremost scholars, not only on Islam, but on the history of religious fundamentalism in the world. Gary Wills takes this title of his article in the New York Review of Books directly from the title of Wah's book, Holy Ignorance. Let me share with you Wah's whole approach about what he calls holy ignorance. Basically, the implication here as it relates to the Pope's encyclical is that conservative Catholics, like Rick Santorum, for example, how do they deal with what the Pope says and their own religious fundamentalist faith? Gary Wills suggests that in order to resolve the conflict within themselves between the fact that I'm a Catholic and this is my Pope, but on the other hand, I can't agree with anything he says, the way you deal with that is you basically convince yourself that the Pope is to be admired. He's a good man, a wonderful example of a good man, as David Brooks mentions, but he's ignorant. We need to not criticize him, but forgive him, because he doesn't know anything about science. If he did, he'd realize how alien, how antithetical science is to the Bible, which is where the truth lies. Since what the Pope is saying in the encyclical is so contrary to what my Bible says, and I know my Bible is right, therefore I know that what the Pope is saying is wrong, then how do I deal with the fact that he's the Pope? The way I deal with it is I forgive him because of his innocence. He doesn't know any better. The Pope is a nice guy, but he's naive. As Gary Wills says, the devil fooled him. Think about that. Wills points out that the French anthropologist Olivier Wah calls this holy ignorance. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's a refusal, a proud refusal to know things, tainted by the arrogance of inevitability. Olivier Wah writes, there's a close link between secularization and religious revivalism. Religious revivalism, this link between secularism and religious revivalism, Wah says, is not a reaction against secularization, but a product of secularization. Secularism engenders religion. The defenders of what really, in the face of hard science, is a lost cause feel persecuted. And the more support there is for hard science, the more support there is for their opponents. The more inflated, the grander they become in the importance of their cause. Secularism is not an alternative to religious belief. Secularism causes it. It causes those inclined toward holy ignorance to find solace in their own plight. The more scientists you bring to the table, the more research you bring to the table, the more scientific evidence you provide to prove the truth of science, the more you are driving those whose druthers are in the direction of holy ignorance to withdraw and to resort to their own faith. The more you cause them to respect the scientist, rare though they are, who come up with evidence to counter the hard science. Those few scientists who deny climate change, these people believe, are on the side of holiness. One of them is worth more than hundreds of the others. The more of the others there are, the more sure you become that you're right. Ross says that this ignorance, this intentional ignorance, applies even to the Bible, which is the source of truth to these folks. Ross says evangelical Protestants follow the Bible to the letter. But a letter freed not only from the original language, but from language itself, in order to see no more than the simple message. It does not question the veracity of the letter of the Scriptures, but nor is it interested in the actual language of the text in the Scriptures, nor, incidentally, in any specific language. These people resort to the Bible in order to refute hard science, to refute climate change. But when they are confronted with text from the Bible that contradicts their own position, they deny it as well. In other words, they know what the truth is. So if there is language in Scripture which contradicts their version of the truth, then they are comfortable rejecting it, and at the same time claiming the Bible as the source of their truth. They use the Bible as a source of the topics. They use the Bible as the spirit of what they believe. It raises the subjects. But as far as what the Bible says about those subjects, in some cases it could be that it's wrong. But that's okay, I'm right. To me, this position by Roy is incredibly insightful. Because what it suggests, what it indicates to me, are those people who learn in bullets, who learn in PowerPoints, who learn in phrases. Those people who deal with the overwhelming amount of information and data in today's world of information overload, not by mastering text, not by trying to work their way through the information, but rather what they are looking for is short phrases that emphasize the truth in order to save them the trouble of reading the whole text. It's the difference between communication by email and communication by Twitter. Twitter is limited to 140 characters. You can say what you think in Twitter, but you can't back it up with evidence. You don't have enough space. So what you end up doing is twittering your way through life. You spend your life asserting truth that you can define in 140 characters. And if you need more than that, then you go to a follow-up tweet. The contemporary mind, we are being educated to think this way, to read for information this way, to learn this way, which means we are learning truth without any of the supporting evidence to either back it up or to deny its validity. We are turning out people who can no longer think because they can't any longer read and analyze large bodies of text. They don't have the time, they don't have the experience, and increasingly they don't have the skill. But they can memorize a series of bullets. They can memorize a PowerPoint overhead, a PowerPoint slide, which gives you a statement of fact and then bullets, 4 or 5 subtopics under it, which reinforce the truth of the statement. There's no information there, not enough information there, to criticize it. That's the danger of primary sources. That's why there are so many people who worry so much about the introduction of the Common Core. That when you talk about people who are really examining statements of the truth in order to be able to determine and validate or criticize the validity of those statements, you are developing the kinds of skills of insight and analysis which potentially run contradictory to a world in which there are so many people out there willing to tell you what the truth is. They want you to believe. They are afraid when you try to understand. It is anti-intellectualism to the extreme. Our friend Horst in Taiwan sent me an email link this morning to an article that has just appeared in Psychology Today about how all of this attack on truth constitutes the latest example of anti-intellectualism. You don't want to know. You don't want access to information. You don't want more data. I know enough. I'm comfortable with what I already believe. Don't confuse me with more evidence. It is not only a rejection of truth. More importantly, it's a rejection of the methodology that the modern world has adopted in the pursuit of truth. What we are saying is there's so much information out there, and I'm so busy, I don't have time to pursue truth. I'm looking for people who have already pursued it and found it. And I want them to tell me what it is in the fewest number of words possible. People used to say, this was 30, 40 years ago, people used to say, don't bother me with the full text. I want the Reader's Digest version. I don't want to read the whole novel. I want to read the condensed version in Reader's Digest. Now, in today's world of information overload, the condensed Reader's Digest version of truth is the PowerPoint presentation where truth is identified and divided into bullets, topics and subtopics, truth that can be memorized, with none of the supporting information as to where it came from or why it's the truth or why it should be the truth or what alternative directions or positions on that definition of truth are, all of these things. Gary Wills points out that in the early 90s, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences undertook a 6-year study called the Fundamentalism Project with funding from the MacArthur Foundation. The 6-year research project concluded that fundamentalism is the unwanted child of secularism. Fundamentalism is exactly what Olivier Roy says it is in Holy Ignorance. It is religion that is individualized. It is religion that is separate from culture. It's separate from politics. It's separate from society. Traditional religion, the existing denominations, Episcopalianism, Presbyterianism, Catholicism, all of these things, have traditionally in history been associated with particular nations, with particular cultures. And so Catholicism in Brazil, for example, was quite different than it was in Poland. And was different again than it was in France or Spain. Traditional religion helped people understand and make sense of the world they lived in, which meant the culture they lived in, the nation they lived in, the people they lived with, and all the rest of it. Fundamentalism is totally different. It's separate from that. It's individual. It's not dependent on language. You have your own language. We call it speaking in tongues. Everybody has their own language. Nobody else has to understand it. It's just between you and God. So therefore, your culture, your history, your tradition, your founding fathers, those who went before you, those whose wisdom prompted them to try to tell you what life was about and what was important in life. None of those things have anything to teach you, because you obviously already have your direct pipeline to truth. And now you are arguing that your nation, this nation, is exceptional because it puts a premium on your freedom to believe whatever the hell you want to believe, as long as you know it's true. This is dangerous. We need to recognize it. We need to begin to deal with it. But we're out of time. It is 59 minutes after the hour. We're at the end of our program, not only for today, but for this entire week. I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to encourage you to be with us on Monday. We'll pick up this topic. We'll begin to look much more substantively at some of the issues that the Pope raises in his encyclical. In the interim, I would encourage you to take a look at it. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. Be safe, and thank you.